Debate of the candidates for Congressional District 2 tonight. We appreciate you tuning in. Right now we're going to introduce Kenneth Brook. He's an incoming senior at McQueen High School, and he will ask a question about No Child Left Behind and the federal government's role in K through 12 education. Kenneth?
It's caught. All right, thank you. Education is mainly administered at a state level. Yet the federal government has set up benchmarks for success, such as No Child Left Behind, and failed to provide adequate funding to fix any problems that might be identified. So if the federal government is going to be maintaining these benchmarks, they should obviously be able to fund any areas in which schools are underperforming. So my question is, in order to address this problem, do you feel that we should increase funds, change the law, or simply leave everything as it is?
Mr. Latham, we'll start with you and work our way. Does everybody understand the question? Go ahead. Sure.
Okay, thank you. It's a tough issue. The biggest single indicator for a child's success in school is their family environment and the connection they have with their parents and how much their parents care about their schooling. Minus that, there's very little any teacher, any amount of money can do. We knew that already in the 60s. There was a report that came out, I'm taking it way back. It was called the Coleman Report. And it said that there's no correlation between the money that you spend per pupil and the performance of that pupil. You can spend a little bit on a pupil and they excel. You can spend a lot on other pupils and they can't pass, they can't move on to the next grade. When we talk about No Child Left Behind, it's wonderful and its merits. To implement it, it's something else. I think we have to distinguish between students who are fully able but are not performing and disabled students. I think disabled students should get all the help they need because disabled students will grow up and be a gift to the world. And
okay, Mr. Davis, thank you very much.
Mr.
Fasano?
Thank you for the question. I'd have to posit a different idea. How about we get the feds out of the business of being in our schools?
Yeah.
First off, I understand the idea of child left behind, and it's very laudable. I agree with it, but I believe that it would be best left in the school district's hands to decide how to spend the money in their school district. They know what their children in their districts need, and they should have the power to administer those funds the way they see fit. Along with, of course, the participation of the parents and the school boards. The states can step in and help them, but the feds need to stay out of the states' rights issues.
Mr. Amodei?
Thank you, Kenneth, for the question from the home of the Lancers. I appreciate that. If the choices are change, more money, or leave it the same, I'm a change person. And I'll tell you why. The responsibility for school district operations and what happens on site and what happens in classrooms is something that I believe, similar to some of the folks that were speaking before, best happens on the site and in the classroom. The amount of money we're spending at the federal level to dictate from on high what the different requirements ought to be in a one-size-fits-all context is simply not working. It doesn't work from the federal government level, and it's something we can do a better job even here in Nevada in terms of power down to those districts, to those sites, and to those classrooms. It's not the same proposition in Winnemucca as it is in Pahrump, as it is in Sparks. And those folks need the ability to go with what works for them. Yes, we should have standards, but we ought to leave the meeting of those standards up to the folks on site. Thanks, Kenneth.
Thanks, Mr. Amodei. Ms. Marshall?
Thank you. No Child Left Behind, part of the problem right there in what we have in Congress today. They enact something and they don't fund it. And worse, when our schools fail, the punishment is they withdraw the money and walk away from our children. This is the wrong set of priorities. If we're going to get this country back on track, if we're going to get Nevada back on track, a prime thing we need to do is to make sure that our schools are taught by the best and the brightest, and that our children are the best and the brightest. If you look at the unemployment numbers, you'll see that the less education you have, the more likely you are to be unemployed. And Nevada has the highest unemployment in the country. I will tell you that my opponent has said he wants to cut 4% of the federal budget every 5 years. That's 20%. We can't afford another 20% cut in education. Those aren't my priorities. We need the best and the brightest for our children and for Nevada.
Thank you, Ms. Marshall. Thanks to Kenneth for that question. And up next on our panelist is Anjanette Damon, host of To The Point, which airs on News 4. And Anjanette, you have a separate question for each candidate?
That's right.
Go right ahead.
Right, I'd like to start with Mr. Fasano. On your website, you advocate for repealing the 16th Amendment, which would essentially eliminate the federal government's ability to impose a federal income tax. I realize you support a very minimal government, but how would you propose funding that?
Like I said earlier, thank you very much for the question. I support a lower income tax. We should be able to have a 9.7 to 9.8% income tax across the board on all citizens. I believe it should be on every citizen in this country that earns a living throughout their life. Because if even the lowest income person pays into the government, even a small amount in tax, they have a vested interest in how that money gets spent. So when I say I favor the elimination of the 16th Amendment, that means I favor eliminating the 16th Amendment in its current standing. We need to rewrite the tax code. We need to get rid of the 80,000 pages in the tax code that provides tax holes for big corporations, that provide tax holes for people of wealth that get away from paying any tax at all. Provide a tax code that doesn't allow for General Electric to not pay a tax at all when they have made millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. So yes, I do think we have to eliminate the 16th Amendment, but we also have to rewrite it to something that makes more sense.
Mr. Lehman, let's talk a little bit more about the flat tax. On your website, you propose a 17% personal income flat tax. You also propose to nearly double the amount of tax revenue paid by U.S. corporations, although you would reduce that rate, you say it would bring in more revenue. My question about the flat income tax is, how do you justify increasing taxes on the country's lowest income earners, which a flat tax would essentially do? And second, with unemployment at an all-time high and the economy teetering, how would you justify essentially doubling corporate taxes?
Well, let's talk about corporate taxes first. Payroll taxes would not be touched under my plan. They account for about $450 billion a year. I'm talking about net income taxes. Right now, the average corporation pays about 20.1% across the country. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, not one single corporation in the United States pays 35% income tax on their net income. It's just not true. Statutorily, yes, it's on the books. Realistically, from accounting principles and practices, they don't. CVS, the drug company, was the highest tax company at 34.3. So I would be looking at the tax credits, eliminating those, especially for mature industries. I would be looking at eliminating or, yes, certainly reducing the carryover and carrybacks for losses. As Tim had just mentioned, you have GE, for example. Let's say they made $5 billion. I'm just saying hypothetically they made $5 billion. I don't have the exact figure here. I have Citibank, and they lost $4.4 billion. They can carry that forward for 20 years and offset 20 years of future profits to $4.4 billion and pay no tax. They could carry it back for 5 years, and if they pay tax, net income tax on any of those 5-year periods, they would actually get a check back from the federal government for losing $4.4 billion in 2009. They'd get a check back from the federal government. That makes no sense. Tim is right. Corporations have many more tax breaks than you and I have. And the answer here, the question of doubling the overall rate of taxation for corporations, is that we would also be looking at the depreciation. And is accelerated depreciation, which went into effect in the late 80s, is that something that is really necessary for companies to spur their investments in plant and equipment? We really need to research that. If it is, fine, we keep it there. But again, these are starting points.
Thank you, Mr. Lehman. Appreciate it. Anjanette, next question.
Thank you. Ms. Marshall, In a recent op-ed urging lawmakers to increase the income tax rate on those who earn more than $1 million a year, Warren Buffett wrote, "My friends and I have been coddled long enough by a billionaire-friendly Congress. Now you've pledged to stand with the middle class and not corporate billionaires. Why then do you oppose eliminating the Bush tax cut on America's wealthiest income owners? And if you believe it's simply a bad time because of the economy, describe the scenario under which you would vote to raise taxes."
We have a lot of questions these days on the economy and taxes. I think those are the issues for us. With respect to Warren Buffett, one of the things that he is addressing is the subsidies and loopholes that we have in our tax code that need to be cleaned up and streamlined. Let me give you an example. Oil companies, subsidies, $100 billion. Hedge funds, subsidies, $20 billion. Corporations who ship their jobs overseas, $85 billion. We could close these subsidies and we could generate revenue for this country. I think we need to do that. But let me talk to you about the Bush tax cuts. They started for someone who makes $250,000, but that includes many small businesses. As I've said before, small businesses are what make up the bread and butter of our economy. We need them, and we need them to hire. So we must keep the Bush tax cuts. But notice that I did both two things, created revenue and kept tax cuts. My opponent, Mr. Amodei, can't do that. He signed a tax pledge, which basically says no tax loophole shall be left behind. The tax pledge says he shall never, he vows, turn down a subsidy. He shall never close a loophole. And so the oil companies will continue with their $100 billion subsidies, and you will continue worried about your next job. These are the wrong priorities. They are not the priorities I would take to Congress. We need jobs here. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, your chance for a vote.
Thank you. This will be brief. Once again, we are short on research and long on rhetoric. The tax pledge that I signed was in November of 2009, which said nothing about loopholes. Thank you.
Thank you, and Jeanette, one more question.
Mr. Amodei, in 2003, you joined with the Democratic senator to propose a $1 billion Nevada tax increase, largely because you realized, or you felt at the time, that the state's budget difficulties couldn't be solved by cuts alone. Do you now reject all revenue options for a solution to the federal debt problem? And if so, are you not relegating yourself to being an ineffective congressman sitting on the sidelines of the debate?
No. Yes and no. Is there any follow-up? I hope that what people will draw from this is when they look at a record that talks about 2003 as somebody who was responding to issues created by requests for government spending increases, some of which included education, by the way, which I supported, and someone who was trying to protect Nevada from becoming a state which had never had an income tax of any type and thought that was the fight, and so fought that by proposing something that many, not in your business, Anjanette, but in others, suggest that Republicans are just no people. And so it's like, here's a way to raise the money if you want to still preserve the business climate. And we were successful in that in 2003. We got rid of an income tax proposal, and the state continued to flourish economically for 5 more years. But now you pivot to the current situation. In my last year in the legislature, 2009, I said no to taxes and no to increased spending. Because 2003 was a period of phenomenal economic prosperity. And guess what? 2011 is a period of phenomenal economic challenge, especially for the private sector in this nation. So when I say that I wouldn't raise taxes in 2011, or during the 16 months that if I get this job I will, it's because I fundamentally believe that it is an absolute incredible thing to think that the time to go ask the private sector that is struggling, most notably in our state, with unemployment and foreclosures and things like that, that we ought to go take some more money out of those folks who are still in businesses' pockets. And that is part of the beginning part, which is telling the truth, and I think it's phenomenally bad policy, and you can tie up all the political rhetoric you want in it, but still drive down Virginia Street or drive down Altman Street in Ely and see how it's going for a tax increase, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Amodei. Thank you,
So is that to say that when it's not 2011, can voters expect that you consider raising taxes?
What voters can consider is the same thing they